Just like the global temperature, sea level is either rising or falling. There is no set standard for sea level. The sea level is rising right now, as it has for the last 15,000 years, because ice that's on land is melting. Since the last ice age, it is melting. There is more ice to melt, just as it happened 130,000 years ago when the sea level was 20 feet higher. We can expect that much more water to melt. But we have pretty good measurements of how fast that's happening. And right now, that's happening at about 1 inch per decade. 1 inch per decade is how the sea level is changing. Now, that's been going on for many, many decades. And you cannot attribute that to human effects.
So what about industrial pollution, pumping all those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? That must be having a catastrophic effect on our ozone layer, and why so many places in the world have seen such violent weather patterns. It's been claimed that it was the greenhouse effect that caused Hurricane Katrina and the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, which became the Asian tsunami.
Studies from space show that the hole, in blue and pink, is growing year by year, and last year spanned the whole Antarctic continent. The culprit is most probably chloro or fluorocarbons used in aerosols and fridges.
Professor of atmospheric science at MIT, Kerry Emanuel, asserted for over 20 years that global warming breeds more frequent and stronger storms, and he shot to prominence after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Emanuel was subsequently acknowledged with a place in Time magazine's 100 People Who Shape Our World. Al Gore devoted the iconic front cover image of his 2006 movie An Inconvenient Truth to Emanuel's warning, portraying a hurricane emerging from a CO2 belching smokestack. Emanuel has since revised his position and now believes that hurricanes and storms may actually decline over the next 200 years and may have little or no correlation with global temperature change.
Global warming not only warms the ocean but warms the atmosphere, and that's accounted for in most theory. What hasn't been accounted for until recently is that as you warm the atmosphere, in one critical metric you dry it out, particularly a few kilometers above the ground, and that dryness is detrimental to both the formation and the intensity of hurricanes. And that is something you don't see if you warm the ocean without warming the atmosphere. It's a property of warming the atmosphere too. So the projected decrease in hurricane activity is related to this drying out of the atmosphere. We don't know how realistic those projections of drying are in comparison to predictions of warming.
Kyoto, the general agreement is, at whatever expense, does nothing. And so it's telling people, you know, changing a light bulb will save the world. That's I guess, a high for some people, but it's nonsense. And so one might reasonably ask the environmental movement or the scientists, what exactly would be needed if we're already 3/4 of the way to a doubling of CO2 in terms of the greenhouse effect? And we think that is horribly dangerous, and there's nothing we can do about that anymore, but we don't want it to get worse. I figure it would involve rolling back emissions not to 1990, not to 1995, but maybe 1840. And that's a pretty extreme thing for a speculative hypothesis that so far is not in agreement with the data.
Yes, I think that any politician today would be wise to be very careful about what they say about environment, because you are immediately branded as being on the far right, as being, a destroyer of worlds, if you side with industry these days. I mean, industry has become a dirty word. Now, I grew up in an industry. I always thought being industrious was a positive thing. But it no longer is, apparently. Apparently industriousness is what is destroying the world. And industry, i.e. capitalism, is the main culprit in the piece. When in fact, That seems to me that industry is what is feeding and clothing and housing us every day. If you actually look at the environmental impacts of poor people living in Guatemala, living in Bangladesh, living in Kenya, you can see it with your eyes. The environments there are not in such great shape because you have people trying to eke out a living who don't care about tomorrow, haven't got the money to clean the water after they foul it, haven't got the money to replant the forest after they cut them for fuel wood. Whereas if they did have sufficient wealth to be able to think beyond the next day or the next week, they would start to care about those things just like we do. So that to me is the big division today in environmental thinking, is right at the very root of it, thinking that human beings are actually a cancer in the first place, so who cares about them? And then at the same time kind of romanticizing the hundreds of millions, billions of people who are living in a state that we would not consider to be dignified. They don't have basic sanitation and clean water and health care and education. Now that is not a dignified life. I have never heard any of these people recognize that poverty is actually an environmental problem. They seem to think that poverty is the solution to our environmental problems.
Although there is no real scientific consensus within the burgeoning global climate sciences, the most promising advances in understanding our global climate changes come from solar observations.